The first time Sand crossed the city limits of Vermilion Wells, no one panicked. It looked like fog at first, orange and weightless, the kind that made children squint and parents say, just wind, but within days, the texture changed. The air began to scrape. What was once dry wind now felt full, heavy, packed with the grit of pulverized earth, and it didn't leave. It stuck to walls, to throats, to the space between molars. Pipes and homes started to spit and wheeze like they were gasping for breath, coughing nothing but groans and steam. Garden hoses curled into brittle ribbons. At the diner, even the tap water tasted scorched like metal that had once known fire. By day 5, people wrapped scarves around their faces, not because they believed it helped, but because doing nothing felt worse. Then the truck stopped. Just stopped. The gas station's owner, Jerry Link, said the interstate had been swallowed. No visibility. Drivers too scared to cross. Soon, water became what people talked about more than God, and that silence between neighbors, the kind reserved for polite distance, fractured. They began to look at each other like competitors, like threats. Vermilion Wells was shrinking, not in size, but in trust. And still, the sand kept falling. Nobody really remembers who first whispered about the green yard. It was one of those rumors that seemed to grow without origin, the kind that caught in people's throats and leapt from lips like it had always existed. Up on Quarry Hill, someone muttered at a water line, "Leaves, actual leaves." At first, it was dismissed. The idea was stupid, delusional, even, but then a few started going up there, quietly. By dusk, from the foot of the hill, they claimed they saw movement, not animals, not wind, but plants. Green ones, real ones. And there was something else, too, a shadow that didn't shift with the dying sun, a patch of space too dense to belong to the rest of this burned-out world. Someone said they smelled something impossible, earth, like after rain. A woman who'd been a florist before everything went dry swore she caught jasmine on the breeze. It didn't take long for the story to spread. By the next evening, groups were gathering at the base of the hill, not yet knocking, just looking, staring, needing. That kind of hunger didn't come from food. It came from watching your children cough themselves hoarse and knowing you'd already used the last clean cloth to wet their mouths. They weren't dreamers. They were desperate. The Hollis house wasn't new. It was plain, square, a 1,950 seconds build with weather-worn shutters and a sag in the porch railing. Nobody in town really knew Thayer and Ione Hollis. They hadn't come to church in years. They hadn't been to the market since last spring. Their mail piled up at the post office until it stopped coming. People assumed they were either dead or close enough to it. But there the house stood, behind its fence, simple wooden slats, whitewashed once upon a time and somehow untouched. Sand didn't collect in drifts on the porch the way it did elsewhere. No visible power lines, no humming generator, and still, the curtains hung clean. The gate was latched, but not locked, though none of the watchers dared test it. Not at first. People have rules for these things, even at the edge of collapse. But hunger warps rules. When Annie Greaves, whose youngest hadn't kept water down in 3 days, finally walked up the hill with a blue jug and a trembling smile, everyone held their breath. She knocked. Once, twice, waited. Her voice cracked when she called out, said she was just looking for help, for a little something to boil. No response. Then, just when she turned to leave, she heard movement inside, footsteps, a shadow, but no door opened. No face appeared. The silence that answered her was so final it felt personal. The next morning, Henry Dean, retired electrician, hands trembling from thirst, made his way up. He didn't knock right away. He stood there for a full minute, squinting through the fence, lips cracked, clutching a bottle that hadn't seen water in over 2 days. He was halfway through saying, "I know you're in there," when he caught a glimpse of Ione through the sheer curtains. She froze when their eyes met. For a second, she didn't blink. She looked exhausted, not like someone thriving, but someone surviving too well for too long. Then, without breaking their gaze, she reached out slowly and pulled the curtain shut. That tiny motion sent a ripple through town bigger than any speech could. People began debating whether the Hollises were hoarding water, whether they were using some illegal well, some hidden supply. Someone even said Thayer had worked on federal projects in the 70s, had maps of underground routes. The rumors thickened like smoke. Meanwhile, every refusal from that house, every closed curtain, every unanswered knock felt less like privacy and more like betrayal. As if the Hollises weren't just turning away neighbors, but making a choice about who deserved to live and who didn't. It wasn't fair, but then again, nothing was. Kellen Shaw watched all this unfold with the detachment of a man who had spent most of his life reporting on other people's disasters. He had covered floods in Arkansas, a chemical fire in Detroit, and a mining collapse in New Mexico. But nothing felt like this. Maybe because this time, he was in it. Not as a journalist, he hadn't written a piece in almost a year, but as a man who fixed broken swamp coolers and offered generator repairs in exchange for stale bread. He didn't know Thayer or Ione beyond names, but he knew silence when it became a weapon. When a town began to unravel, it was never because of just the storm, it was the aftermath. The looking, the needing, the way people measured their own suffering against the silence of others and decided that silence was cruelty. So when Kellen saw the second person go up that hill and get nothing back, he knew the story had changed. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was an accusation, and accusations spread faster than sand. He began taking notes again, not for print, but for himself, for when this was all over. If it ever would be. That night, the wind picked up, harder than before. The sky turned the color of dried blood, rust smeared across the horizon. At the foot of Quarry Hill, people gathered again, fewer than before, but angrier, watching. Whispers passed like matches. The fence stood still, as always, pale and bare and unmoving, and the house behind it stayed quiet. No lights, no voices. Then Annie returned, this time with her husband, and knocked again. 1, 2, 3. The sound echoed in a way that felt final. Nothing. Thayer didn't open the door. Ione didn't move the curtain. That stillness hit different now. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like choice. And in that choice, a wound opened. A deep one. The kind that didn't bleed, but infected everything. By the time Annie walked back down, holding her husband's hand like a thread unraveling, no one said anything. They didn't need to. The house had spoken, not with words, but with the kind of silence that tells you exactly what you're worth. And for Vermilion Wells, that silence was unbearable. By the fourth week of dust, Vermilion Wells had stopped pretending the water lines would come back. The only working spigot left was at the back of the old VFW hall, bitter tasting, slow dripping, guarded by a handwritten list and a rotation of teenagers with clipboards who enforced fairness with the panic of people forced into authority too young. Each household got a 2-gallon limit per day, but even then, fights broke out. People didn't look each other in the eyes anymore. When you're standing in a line for water with your mouth already dry, you stop seeing faces, you see mouths that might get more than yours. But after sunset, that hunger turned spiritual. The hill that held the Hollis home became something mythic. Folks walked there in silence, some with rosaries in hand, others with curses under their breath, but all with the same question, why not us? From the bottom of Quarry Hill, they stared upward like the green yard might open itself one night and choose them. No one admitted to believing in miracles, but more and more came each night, just to look, just to stand closer. The fence didn't move, the house didn't flicker, still, they came. Kellen Shaw hadn't intended to climb the hill that day. He'd spent the morning rewiring a busted attic fan for a couple with a newborn, trading the job for a gallon of store-bought water and 3 cans of green beans. It was the kind of bargain that had become normal barter, apology, small prayers dressed up as trades. But something about the crowd at the base of the hill pulled at him. They weren't angry, not yet, but he recognized the shape of what they were becoming. He'd seen it before in disaster zones, refugee camps, cities under martial law. There was a quiet that came before desperation turned sharp, and Vermilion Wells was humming with it. So he started walking, not with a jug or a petition, but with the reporter's instinct he thought he'd buried months ago. He didn't want water, he wanted truth, and if the Hollises had even a fraction of what the town said they did, then the truth was rotting behind that fence. As he climbed, dust bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. At the top, near the gate, he found her, Merritt Kane. Sheriff's deputy, badge dull with grit, mouth pulled in a line that wasn't quite anger but wasn't peace either. She was standing like a soldier outside a border she didn't agree with, hand resting on a flashlight like it was a weapon she hoped she wouldn't have to use. "Don't go knocking," Merritt said before he could open his mouth. Her voice was low, cracked, like she'd stopped bothering to hydrate properly days ago. "They're not coming out." Kellen studied her face, noting the deep shadows under her eyes, the set of her jaw. "They've got water in there," he said, not as an accusation, just fact. Merritt didn't deny it. She just looked away for a moment, then back at the crowd below, shifting like a low tide. "They've got something, but they don't want the town crawling in after it." Thayer said he wouldn't open the door, no matter who came. Kellen raised an eyebrow. And you believe him? Merritt's lips twisted, a smile with no warmth. I believe he means it. There was a silence between them then, not heavy, but tense. Kellen glanced at the fence, its wood clean of dust, and then at Merritt's hand, which had begun to tremble just slightly, just enough to betray her fear. Not of the Hollises, of the crowd, of the moment when someone decided they'd had enough of waiting. What happens when someone climbs it? He asked. Merritt didn't answer right away. She looked down the hill, and when she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. Then I have to choose which side I'm on. Kellen stepped closer to the fence and raised his voice, careful not to shout. Thayer, Ione, it's Kellen Shaw. I just want to talk. No answer, not even a shift of curtains. He waited, letting the silence stretch, then added, you don't have to open the door. Just let me ask a question or two. For the town's sake, that was the hook he used. The town. He didn't expect it to work, but after 10 more seconds, a flicker of movement appeared behind one of the front windows. The curtain twitched. A face emerged, pale, drawn, unmistakably Ione Hollis. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. Her eyes scanned the hill behind him, the scattered group of watchers who hadn't left even as the sun began to drop. Her gaze caught on a young girl barely 13 clutching a blanket around her shoulders and chewing the fabric. Ione's face cracked, just a little. She blinked fast, shook her head like someone shaking off a dream, and stepped back. The curtain fell again. Kellen barely had time to process the exchange before a voice, deep and controlled, came from just behind the door. Go home. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was something worse, final. There was a murmur from the people down the hill as Kellen turned back. One man muttered, they could be saving us. Another, what if they're the reason the rest of us are dying? The tension wasn't open conflict yet, but it was a breath away. Kellen walked back toward Merritt, watching her brace herself as if expecting blame. He said it again? She asked. Kellen nodded. Same as before. Merritt closed her eyes for a second, exhaling slowly. You know what the worst part is? She said. They're not evil, not cruel. If they were, it'd be easier. Kellen glanced at the window again, half expecting Ione to appear once more. They're afraid, he said. Merritt nodded. Aren't we all? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kellen said, this fence. It's not wood, it's a decision. Merritt looked at him sharply, but didn't argue. Behind them, someone down the hill started to chant. Low, repetitive, hope weaponized. Open the gate, over and over, like a prayer, or a threat. Merritt shifted, hand on her flashlight again, jaw set. That fence won't bend, she murmured. And if someone tries to break it, I don't know what's going to give first, Thayer or the town. The sky was dimming, the orange bleeding into gray. Still, no one moved. The crowd stayed where it was, some sitting, some standing, all waiting for something to change, or break, or give in. Kellen stepped back, watching the fence, the window, the house behind it. Ione did not return. Thayer did not speak again. The house remained silent, but it was a silence louder than any storm, because now it had a shape. It had eyes. It had a door that had looked at a child and still chose to remain closed. And the people, those pilgrims of the hill, they didn't leave. They didn't riot. Not yet. They simply learned where to stand. At the fence's edge. Just close enough to hope. Just far enough not to be a threat. A balance held by breath and dust and exhaustion. Merritt stayed at her post, arms folded now, as if she could hold back what would come next with her spine alone. Kellen turned away, notebook untouched, and began to walk down the hill. Behind him, the chant had stopped, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the absence of sound. It was waiting, and that, he knew, was worse. Wren Calder didn't like waiting. She never had. Not in classrooms, not in checkout lines, not at water rations where adults whispered like fear had become contagious. Waiting meant trusting someone else to act, and Wren hadn't learned that years ago. She'd grown up watching her mother wait for answers that never came, about bills, about her dad, about the world right outside their window that kept crumbling in slow, mean ways. So now, when the town shuffled in silence at the foot of the Hollis Hill, staring up at something they didn't understand and wouldn't question out loud, Wren made her choice. She didn't ask permission. She didn't even tell her mother. She waited until the breathing in the next room evened out, until the dry groan of the swamp cooler masked the sound of the door hinge, and she left. Her feet moved fast but soft, the kind of walk that comes from knowing how to move when you don't want to be seen. Halfway up Quarry Hill, she stopped not because she was afraid, but because her chest was doing that thing again, that slow build of heat she couldn't name. Fear dressed as curiosity. That's what her mom called it once. Ren liked it better the other way around. She reached the fence just before midnight, when the town behind her had settled into its usual sleep of half-choked dreams and sand-covered sheets. Up close, the yard looked unreal. She'd expected it to feel like an illusion that maybe from the bottom of the hill, the green had been exaggerated, like how thirst-made stories grow. But it wasn't. The grass wasn't perfect. No, but it was alive. Real blades of green, not faded brown, not plastic, not painted. There were plants along the edge of the house, their leaves lifted, not drooping like the corpses lining every other porch in town. Ren pressed her hand to one of the fence posts and peered through the slats, barely breathing. The soil wasn't cracked. That was the strangest part. There was moisture, not puddles or pools, but the earth had a darkness to it, like it had been recently watered. She leaned in farther, unsure what she was looking for, but certain something waited. Then she heard it. Not a splash or a rush, nothing dramatic. Just a steady hum, soft and constant, like the exhale of something alive. Water. It was water. Not leaking, not gushing, flowing, controlled. She pressed her ear against the wood. It was faint, but the vibration was there, traveling up from somewhere deep. It was impossible, and yet. She closed her eyes and listened, the way you do when you don't trust your own senses. And there it was again, that rhythmic pulse. Her hand moved to the slats, fingertips brushing the wood as if she could trace the sound's origin by feel alone. Beneath her palm, the post was warmer than she expected. Not heat from sun, but residual warmth, like breath held too long. She didn't move for several seconds, hypnotized by the sensation that something beneath her was breathing. That's when the porch light flicked on. The sudden change didn't come with a sound, but it felt seismic. Ren froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, panic rising fast and hot, but her feet wouldn't move. And then the front door creaked open, just enough to let out a figure slide, gray-haired, wrapped in a cardigan that had seen better decades. Ione Hollis. She stepped into the light without surprise, like she'd known someone was there all along. Her eyes swept the yard once, then landed on Ren through the fence. They held each other's gaze across slats in silence, neither one flinching, though Ren could barely breathe. She expected anger, a threat, something loud. But what came instead felt heavier than a shout. Ione's expression didn't shift into rage, it collapsed into something closer to grief. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her gaze, full of something cracked and old, softened when it landed on Ren's face. She raised a hand, slow and deliberate, and for a moment it hovered in midair like she might reach through the fence. But the hand didn't extend. It dropped, not in fear, in resignation, like a woman who had made this exact motion too many times before. Ren didn't know whether to apologize or run. But her legs remained rooted. Ione looked at her for 1 second longer, then turned. No drama, no slam of the door. She simply stepped back inside, her cardigan catching slightly on the edge of the railing, then disappearing behind the door as it clicked shut. The porch light dimmed to black. Ren was left staring into the space where she had been, heart still punching, chest full of something that wasn't quite sadness, wasn't quite awe. A part of her wanted to yell, to demand answers, but another part, stronger, quieter, understood she had just been shown something sacred, not welcomed, not rejected, witnessed. She didn't linger. The sound was still there, faint and steady, but Ren knew better than to push her luck. She backed away from the fence slowly, memorizing every step, every detail. The yard was real, the water was real, and the woman inside that house was not a villain. That much was clear. Ren had seen villains before, men who took what wasn't theirs, people who smiled while others starved. Ione was different. She looked like someone who had already lost too much and was still losing. As she moved down the hill, Ren replayed the moment again and again, trying to make sense of what hadn't been said. The sound of the water was clearer now in her memory than it had been in her ears. She could feel it in her hands, vibrating like a buried truth, like a secret trying to surface. She didn't run. She didn't sneak back into the house. She entered through the front door, dusted off her shoes, and sat on the floor of her room in the dark, the shape of Ione's hand still etched in her mind. That night, she didn't sleep. By morning, the quiet rumor had become a current. Ren didn't speak of it first. She hadn't told anyone, not her mother, not her friends, not even herself, not out loud. But something about her face, about the way her hands fidgeted during breakfast, gave her away. Her cousin, Milo, asked if she was sick. Ren said no, but the lie didn't matter. Someone else had seen her walking back from the hill. Someone else whispered it over breakfast at the relief tent. By afternoon, the words were out. Ren called her herd water. That simple sentence turned heads and lit fires. People argued. Some laughed. Others asked questions. What kind of water? Where exactly? Was it a leak? Was it a spring? Some swore they'd already believed it. Some accused her of lying. But most just listened, quietly, hopefully. The idea that water still moved up there, behind that fence, changed everything. It wasn't just a miracle anymore, it was a mystery with a witness. Ren said nothing. She let them wonder. She let them believe. Because the sound was real. She had felt it in her bones. And if that was a lie, then the truth was something she never wanted to hold. The moment Lark's breathing shifted from shallow to strained, June Eames knew she couldn't wait another night. She sat cross-legged on the trailer's linoleum floor, holding her son's head in her lap, whispering nonsense words just to keep herself from screaming. The inhaler had given its final hiss hours ago, emptied like everything else in town. His chest rose and fell with unnatural effort, each breath a scrape. June counted them, barely moving her lips. She had once been the kind of woman who trusted order rotations, clinics, church relief, but that had been 3 dry weeks ago. Now the clinic was dark, its shelves ransacked, its doors chained by people desperate to protect what was no longer there. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She hadn't eaten in 1. Her knees ached from crouching over Lark for so long, but pain didn't matter, only breath mattered. When Lark whimpered, barely able to exhale, she made the decision without words. She wrapped him in a blanket, tied it around her shoulders like a harness, and lifted him. Her body screamed in protest. She ignored it. With trembling legs and bleeding knees from the sharp gravel near the trailer steps, she began the climb up Quarry Hill, not toward salvation, but toward the only rumor left. Merritt saw her first. She was standing patrol again, like always, though she no longer knew if it was duty or guilt that rooted her there. When she recognized June, she moved instinctively, striding forward with urgency, but stopping herself from touching her. "June," she said, voice low. "What are you doing?" The answer was written all over her face, in the wild panic of her eyes and the way Lark's tiny frame bounced against her back. "He's not breathing right," June managed. "He's turning blue." Merritt opened her mouth to say something, maybe to stop her, maybe to offer another idea, but none came. There were no other ideas. No inhalers, no oxygen, no clinics. Just the house. Just the fence. "I can't tell you to do it," Merritt finally said, "but I won't stop you." June nodded once, already moving. Behind them, others were starting to notice. Whispers turned into movement. The crowd that had formed each evening was gathering again, but now there was a reason to watch. Kellen Shaw was among them, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the woman dragging her child up the hill with the kind of determination that looked like madness. But it wasn't madness. It was clarity, born of love and dust and desperation. When June reached the porch, she didn't hesitate. She raised her fist and pounded the door with every ounce of strength left in her. 1 knock, 2, 3. Her knuckles split, but she didn't stop. "Please," she cried. "Please, he's dying." From behind the door, nothing. The silence was instant, total, the kind that fills your ears like pressure underwater. June hit the door again, tears mixing with sweat, Lark groaning weakly against her shoulder. Kellen had stepped closer by now, so close he could hear the hoarseness in the boy's breath, the tight wheeze of collapse. He didn't believe in miracles, not anymore, but even he knew this wasn't about belief. It was about action. And he knew, down to his bones, that if the door didn't open in the next 10 seconds, Lark wouldn't survive the night. Behind him, Merritt hovered, hand near her weapon, not threatening, but ready, conflicted. She looked toward the porch with the stare of someone caught between the law and something older, more primal. Then finally the locks shifted. Click, click. The handle turned. Thayer Hollis opened the door just wide enough to see the boy's face. His eyes scanned Lark's lips, the bluish tint, the twitching fingers. His expression didn't shift to pity. It shifted to something far more haunted. It was recognition. That was what made Thayer flinch, some memory behind his eyes, some past that echoed too loudly in Lark's fragile form. For a second, he looked like a man caught in a loop, forced to watch a pain he thought he'd buried. "Ione," he called, voice uneven. "Now." She appeared behind him, already moving, tears in her eyes before she even saw the child. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached out and helped lift Lark from June's back, unwrapping the blanket with trembling hands. "Come in," she said, not to June alone, but to the emergency itself. June stumbled forward, barely able to say thank you. Thayer stepped aside to let them through, but only them. Before Kellen or anyone else could follow, he stepped back out onto the porch, pulled the door behind him, and stood between the house and the crowd that had started to move closer. His body, lean and weathered, was suddenly a barricade. "Only them," he said. His voice broke on the second word. For the first time since this began, it wasn't just firm, it was shaking. It was sorrowful. It carried the weight of a man who knew what he was denying. Merritt took a slow step forward, unsure. Her hand, still near her holster, twitched, but she let it fall away, ashamed, almost, that it had ever been there. "Thayer," she said quietly, "they'll start to push." He nodded once. "I know." Kellen came to stand beside her, watching Thayer with new eyes. "You're not saying no because you don't care," he murmured. "You're saying no because if you say yes to everyone, it ends," Thayer said, cutting in. "The green, the clean, the filters, all of it. We can't sustain more. We never could." His hands were trembling now, fingers clenched into fists. "That boy, he reminded me of someone." He didn't explain who, and no one asked. Some things don't need saying. Behind the door, the sound of Lark coughing stronger, deeper broke the silence. Ione was already at work, administering something. The boy wasn't saved, but he wasn't dying anymore. Not this second. And for now, that was everything. Kellen turned back to the crowd, seeing the shifting faces, the hunger, the calculation. The moment was fragile. One wrong word and it would shatter. But Thayer didn't retreat. He stayed, arms at his sides, eyes full of something other than fear. Something closer to grief, worn thin by resolve. The sun was lowering, its light casting long lines behind the fence. The people didn't charge. Not yet, but they didn't leave either. They stood in place, watching Thayer stand guard over the door he had just opened and then closed again. His refusal was not a gate slamming shut, it was a wound exposed. It told the truth in its own brutal language: we cannot save everyone. Merritt remained near the porch, her posture no longer defensive but reverent, as if honoring a decision too heavy for any one person to carry. Kellen stayed quiet, the notepad in his pocket untouched, words too small for what had just happened. June sat on the other side of the door, rocking gently with Lark in her arms, whispering something only a mother says when the worst has passed, but the fear hasn't. Inside, Ione worked in silence, but her tears hadn't stopped. Outside, Thayer stood between two storms, the one behind the door and the one building in the crowd, and he held his ground not as a savior, but as a man trying to buy the world one more night of breath. The line had been drawn. Only them, he had said, and the hill believed him. The air inside the Hollis house was the kind that made people remember how breathing was supposed to feel. Cool, clean, forgiving. June staggered in, clutching Lark so tightly that Ione had to gently pry him from her arms. When his wheezing softened just slightly, June broke. A single sob escaped, then a cascade, uncontrollable. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, the kind of sound that had been building for weeks without permission. It seemed to soak into the walls, into the very floor, like grief being wrung out after too long. Ione worked quickly. Her hands moved with the precision that came from knowing what it meant to be too late and not wanting to be again. She checked Lark's pulse, opened his mouth, pressed the damp cloth to his temple. "Breathe with him," she told June. "Match his pace." June obeyed, almost on instinct. Her eyes never left her son. Behind them, Kellen hovered, unsure where to stand. His presence felt like trespass, yet something in Thayer's earlier silence had allowed it. From the edge of the kitchen, Kellen caught his first close-up view of the legendary yard. It looked impossibly alive, every leaf sharp and full, like nature hadn't gotten the memo about the end of the world. But Kellen's gaze didn't stop with the yard. Just beside the window, stacked meticulously against the wall, were several large containers, military grade, by the look of them labeled by hand. The labels weren't casual. They were systematic: date ranges, chemical symbols, red ink warnings. Each container was part of a system. This wasn't a garden born of luck or prayer. It was curated, managed, protected. And more than that, it was controlled. Thayer caught him looking and stiffened, his entire posture hardening like a man expecting to be judged. Kellen said nothing, but the questions were already rising inside him like steam. What are they filtering? Where is it coming from? Why the secrecy? In the narrow hallway between kitchen and back door, Thayer stepped into Kellen's path and didn't move. Not everything is yours to write, Thayer said, his voice low but steady. I'm not writing, Kellen replied. Then what are you doing? Thayer asked. There was no anger, just fatigue, a weariness so complete that it had eroded pride. Trying to understand, Kellen answered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway became a space of quiet warfare, curiosity versus protection, truth versus consequence. Outside, Ren had slipped through a break in the fence unnoticed, her movements practiced and silent. She had waited for the right moment, watching until the attention shifted to the front of the house. The gap in the boards wasn't wide, but she was small enough to squeeze through. Once inside, she froze. The green was brighter than she remembered, more vivid up close. The grass gave under her feet, not dry, not brittle, alive. She moved slowly, reverently, until something odd caught her eye. A patch of grass, deeper in color, as if overfed. She crouched, brushing aside a few small stones, and her fingers landed on something sharp. A seam, metal. She pulled gently, revealing the edge of a hatch round, flat, bolted into the ground. The metal was ice cold to the touch, wrong for the heat around it. She pressed her palm against it, and a shiver ran up her arm. This was not just a garden. This was built, engineered, and whatever was under that hatch was part of the reason this place was thriving while the town starved. She looked up, half expecting someone to yell, but the yard was still. Ren didn't open the hatch. She didn't need to. The secret was already whispering. Back inside, June sat now in a corner with Lark asleep in her lap, color returning slowly to his cheeks. Ione hovered nearby, occasionally wiping his forehead, but her hands trembled more now, the aftermath settling in. Thayer hadn't re-entered yet, and Kellen remained half in the hallway, half in the kitchen, mind spinning. Why hide it? He finally asked Ione, quietly. She didn't look at him. Instead, she moved to the sink, filled a small glass from a metal canister, and placed it gently on the counter without drinking. Her shoulders were hunched in a way that betrayed the cost of every decision. Because if they drink it wrong, she whispered, her voice cracking, they'll die. Kellen felt the sentence land like a slap. What do you mean wrong? Ione glanced at him now, eyes glistening. It's not rainwater. It's not clean. It's from something old. Below. We filter it, test it, manage doses. But we barely have enough for the two of us. Every drop is counted. Every mistake. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The green outside wasn't mercy. It was calculation. The miracle the town had been praying for came with a ledger. Then came the sound of a truck. Dust, movement, voices. From the front yard, raised voices began to clash with the fragile stillness of the home. Blaine Rusk had arrived. Kellen moved to the window, just in time to see him stepping out of his vehicle like a man preparing for a performance. This is theft, Blaine barked, not even looking at Thayer but past him, toward the door, the house, the land. You don't get to keep salvation to yourself. Thayer didn't answer. He didn't move. Ione pressed her back against the kitchen wall like she could feel every word. June held Lark tighter, shielding his ears. Kellen saw it clearly now. Blaine wasn't just angry. He was threatened. The existence of this yard, this system, undermined the illusion of control he'd been clinging to. This is a private miracle in a public crisis, Blaine continued, pacing. You open that door, or I bring others. Thayer's jaw clenched, his body immobile. But before anyone could speak again, Ione muttered it just loud enough for Kellen to catch. If they drink it wrong, they'll die. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth she was tired of carrying alone. The breach didn't begin with shouting or shattered glass. It started with Blaine Rusk leaning against the fence like it belonged to him. His tone was smooth, politician sure, calculated to sound like generosity. He offered what desperate people wanted to hear: food shipments rerouted, propane deliveries guaranteed, medical staff on rotation. He even promised to label the Hollis property an emergency aid zone, a registered community oasis, he called it, like branding could fix a dying town. He kept his voice low, warm, performative, eyes drifting over the gathering crowd like a shepherd calming skittish sheep. But the words weren't meant for the people. They were aimed through the slats, at the man behind the porch. Thayer listened from his usual place, arms crossed, jaw locked tight. For a long beat, he didn't respond. And when he finally did, it was with a single word: no speech, no reasoning, just refusal, naked and absolute. It cracked through the illusion like glass under strain. The crowd stiffened, murmurs shifted toward movement. Merritt saw the tension spiking and immediately stepped between the first few bodies, trying to stall the tide before it surged. Her voice wavered only slightly as she barked for space, but the air had changed. The promise had turned into threat. Kellen had been standing near the side of the fence, notebook still in his back pocket, forgotten. He saw it building an edge in Blaine's posture, the clench of someone's hand on a broken shovel handle, the heat of anticipation in too many eyes. He knew what came next if no one stepped forward. So he did the one thing he hated most, he pleaded. Moving toward the gate, he called out, "Thayer, just me. No one else. Let me see. Let me understand." There was no dignity in it, no clever phrasing, just raw appeal. If I can tell them something true, maybe they'll back down. For a long moment, Thayer didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped down from the porch and unlatched the gate, not wide, just enough for Kellen to slip through. The door opened behind him without a word, and they vanished into the house, leaving the crowd behind to mutter and guess. Inside, the quiet was heavier than before. Kellen followed Thayer through a narrow hall, down a tight back corridor until they reached a small, locked panel in the floor. No welcome, no warning, just a key, a twist, and the groan of metal lifting to reveal a darkness below. The air beneath the hatch hit Kellen like a forgotten memory, metal, moisture, and age. A narrow staircase descended into a space that looked less like a basement and more like a bunker. Rust streaked the concrete. Pipes coiled along the walls like veins, some wrapped in fraying insulation, others open and humming. Thayer moved first, wordless, leading Kellen to a large cistern resting on a concrete slab, its surface glinting under a single hanging bulb. "It comes from there," Thayer said. His voice echoed slightly, distant. A buried line, used to be connected to a federal test site, water reclamation, filtration, emergency storage. It's off-grid now, forgotten, but the line still runs. Kellen circled slowly, taking it in. "So it's usable?" he asked. Thayer nodded once. "Barely. Not safely. Not directly." He reached to the side, revealing a shelf stacked with filters, some cracked, others still sealed. "It's contaminated. Radiation, chemical residue, bacteria, the kind of stuff that won't kill you today, but will make sure you don't see 50. We purify what we can. These," he tapped a canister, "are the only reason we're not dead." His tone wasn't bitter. It was factual, like a man explaining how gravity works. "And you don't have enough," Kellen said. "No," Thayer confirmed. "Not even close." Kellen ran a hand over one of the sealed filters, reading the faded labels, the date stamps. The handwriting was precise, dated by month, color-coded by risk level. "You tracked it all," he said, more to himself than to Thayer. "You've been planning for this." Thayer didn't deny it. "My father worked on the original site. He knew what was down there, taught me how to build around it. He thought the system might save lives one day. But not like this." There was a heaviness in his voice, regret wrapped in purpose. "We thought we could hold on long enough. Share a little when things got better." But things never got better. Kellen turned, trying to reconcile what he'd just seen with the image of the yard above, the illusion of peace, of bounty. "So the green is bought with this?" he asked, "with rationed risk?" Thayer nodded. "Every leaf out there has a cost. Every glass of water has a clock attached to it. We're not saving the town by hiding this. We're delaying the moment they poison themselves." Kellen exhaled, slow. The yard wasn't a miracle. It was a countdown disguised as grace, and the Hollises weren't selfish. They were the dam holding back a flood of panic, knowing it would break eventually. Back upstairs, the light through the windows was dimming. The crowd outside was still shifting, restlessly tethered to Blaine's voice, which now carried a sharper edge. Kellen stood by the front door, unsure of what to say. "If I tell them," he said slowly, "they might back off. But they might also riot." Thayer didn't move from the hallway. "Then tell them what they need to hear, not what they want." Kellen turned to face him. "And what's that?" Thayer's face was stone. "That this isn't salvation. It's survival, barely. That if they take it now, they end it for everyone. That they don't get to make that choice for each other." The door remained closed. The fence still held. But outside, Merritt's voice rose in argument with Blaine, trying to stall something inevitable. Kellen looked down at his hands. They felt unclean, just from holding the filters. He suddenly understood why the Hollises kept the truth buried. It wasn't just the water that was contaminated. It was the desperation around it, the belief that a solution could be owned, consumed, or demanded. Kellen didn't write anything down. He couldn't. What he'd seen wasn't a story. It was a warning. Blaine Rusk never shouted. That was his trick. He used his voice like it was carved from certainty, measured, rehearsed again. When the rumors about the cistern finally reached the wider town, it took him less than a day to twist them. He called it theft. Not loudly, not in a rage, but in the steady, believable tone of a man who claimed to be disappointed on behalf of everyone else. He repeated Kellen's hesitant words: filters, contamination, limits, but reassembled them into a story that fit his purpose. The Hollises, he told them, had chosen themselves. They had engineered a secret supply, hoarded it, kept children coughing and parents begging while they watered grass. It's not survival, Blaine said, it's betrayal. And when people asked if it was true, if it could really be that black and white, he gave them what fear always gives the hungry: permission. That night, the crowd came back not with buckets or questions, but with crowbars and shovels and the kind of posture that said, "We're not asking anymore." Merritt stood at the hill's crest with two deputies and a sick ache in her throat. Her voice was hoarse from too many nights of reasoning. It didn't carry like it used to. Kellen stood beside her, arms folded tight across his chest, watching the movement below with a dread that had nothing to do with what they might take and everything to do with what they might become. He knew that once a group tasted the logic of desperation, it didn't retreat, it spread. "We can't hold this line," Merritt muttered. Her badge caught the lantern light, but it looked like paper now. "They're not going to listen." Kellen didn't answer right away. He was thinking about how quickly people rewrote history when they needed to survive. Just a few days ago, this hill had been a place of whispered awe. Now it was a target. "Then let me go in," he said finally. "Let me try one more time." Merritt gave him a look that was all exhaustion and no hope, but she stepped aside. Kellen moved fast, slipping through the gate before anyone could stop him. Inside, the house felt like a different world. Ione was already in the kitchen, her hands trembling around a cup she wasn't drinking from. "It started," she said without looking up. Thayer stood by the back door, sweat clinging to his temples, eyes fixed on nothing. "They won't wait until morning." The sound of the first tool scraping the fence came minutes later. Thayer didn't flinch. He locked the hatch to the basement himself, the metal bar sliding home with a finality that felt like sealing off air. Then he sat down against it, spine pressed to the wood, as if his body alone could keep the town out. "If they get down there," he said quietly, "they won't understand the limits. They'll flood it, drink it, bathe in it, die by it." Kellen crouched beside him, hands open, empty. "You should let me talk to them." "No," Thayer replied, not harshly, but as a man whose mind had already played out every ending. "They've made up their minds. Words won't save anyone now." Upstairs, Ione leaned against the kitchen wall, her eyes shut, whispering a name Kellen didn't recognize. It wasn't Thayer's. It wasn't Lark. It was old, weighty, private, someone she'd lost long before this began. A memory used as a shield. June, seated near the pantry, held Lark close against her chest. She didn't speak. Her lips moved in silent gratitude. Over and over, words stuck between prayer and disbelief. The boy's breathing had steadied, but the air around him had thickened with the pressure of what was coming. In the back corner, Wren was pacing, not out of fear, but fury. She had snuck back in through the broken board again after overhearing what Blaine was telling the crowd. She had watched the tools being passed hand to hand, had seen the faces of people she once played soccer with sharpening into something ugly. "They don't get it," she said suddenly, loud enough to make Ione look up. "They think they're saving themselves, but they'll kill themselves. They'll kill all of us." No one contradicted her. No one tried to calm her. Wren grabbed a pen from the counter and ripped a scrap of paper from an old envelope. She scribbled fast, pressing so hard the ink bled through. Her hands shook as she shoved the note toward Kellen. "Give this to them. Read it if you have to. Just make them understand." Kellen unfolded it and read the messy, all-caps letters. "If they break in, they'll die. Tell them before it's too late." He looked up and saw Wren staring at him, not like a kid, but like someone begging him to be braver than he'd ever been. It wasn't a message. It was a handoff, a transfer of responsibility no one else had taken. Outside, the storm began to rise. Wind whipped against the house, sharp with sand, but the real threat was human. The crowd was louder now, angrier, their fear alchemized into justification. Blaine's voice rose above them all, preaching ownership, justice, survival. Kellen opened the front door a crack and stared out at the mob, Wren's note clenched in his fist. "What are you going to do?" Merritt asked from her spot near the porch. Her voice was flat, almost numb. Kellen didn't answer right away. He was reading the note again, as if the words might shift into something easier. I'm not chasing a story anymore, he said at last. I'm trying to stop a funeral. He stepped outside, the wind hitting him full force. The noise of the crowd surged, but he didn't flinch. He held the note up, not like a flag, but like evidence. The paper shook in his hand, not from the weather, but from what it meant. Behind him, the house remained still. Thayer didn't move. Ione didn't speak. But in the silence of that porch, something shifted. The siege had begun, but someone had finally named what it really was, the last chance not to destroy themselves. The storm didn't wait for logic. It roared in hard, fast, and ugly, turning the edge of town into a smear of red wind and grit. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst came in the form of a man named Percy Lawton, one of Blaine's louder allies, who shoved his way through the fence gap with a smirk and a canteen. The crowd parted around him like they'd already decided he would be their proof. It's all lies, he shouted, stumbling into the yard like he owned it. This place is hoarding clean water while our kids choke. He bent down and scooped from the old steel trough by the hatch, where runoff had pooled, unchecked, and lifted the canteen in a mock toast. Kellen shouted from the porch, "Don't," but Percy was already drinking. The crowd gasped, some cheering, some falling dead silent. It was a dare to the universe, to Thayer, to every warning they'd been given. And for a while, nothing happened. Percy raised his arms like a victor. "Tastes fine," he roared. But Kellen knew better. That's what made it cruel, the delay. Poison that worked slowly always fooled the desperate. Percy laughed his way back to the fence, but by morning, he would be crawling. Inside the house, the mood shifted the second the act was done. No more illusions. The final line had been crossed. Thayer didn't speak as he opened the storage cabinet and began counting what remained. Each filter had been wrapped like gold, dated and logged, and now he moved through them with hands that had never shaken this badly before. Kellen sat nearby, watching in silence, knowing what Thayer wouldn't say out loud. There weren't enough. Not for the people inside. Not for what was coming. Ione sat at the table, a notepad open in front of her, pen in hand. She didn't hesitate. She began writing names, not in panic, not in rush, but with the reverence of someone reciting a eulogy. She divided the list: those who could safely drink, those who might endure contaminated water longer, those who would fade. No one had to ask which list they were on. June stood and offered to leave. Her voice was quiet but clear. "You saved my son. That was more than I ever expected. Let us go now. Let someone else take our place." Thayer looked at her, heart cracked in his eyes, but said nothing. Then Ren moved. "No," Ren said, stepping between the door and June. "You're not going anywhere." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, final. This place didn't survive because people left. It survived because someone stayed and kept track. Because someone did the hard thing. She turned to face Thayer. "Let me help. I know the yard. I know how you record it. Teach me." Ione looked at her with a kind of startled softness, then slowly nodded. Ren planted herself at the entrance, arms crossed, as if she could hold back the world with just her posture. "We don't get to save everyone," she said. "But we don't get to decide who dies first, either." Her words cut through the room like wind through cracked glass. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mara came in from outside, her uniform coated in red dust, her face streaked with something harder than grief. "I heard what happened," she said. "He's already throwing up." She didn't have to say who. They all knew. She looked at the notepad, at Ione's list. "If you let me see it, I'll enforce it." Her voice broke at the end. "Even if it makes everyone hate me." Thayer met her eyes, and something shifted just slightly. For days, maybe longer, he had stood like stone. But now his shoulders dropped, his jaw loosened, and what remained of his pride softened into something else: trust. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded map, one that had yellowed at the corners and was covered in notes written in a hand Kellen recognized now as his. Thayer placed it on the table, next to the list. "This is the conduit," he said. "The flow lines, the filtration checkpoints, the weak spots, the failed dates." He pointed to small red circles drawn years ago, all of them marked with numbers and initials. "These are the anniversaries. Every time it almost went bad." Merritt leaned over, scanning the page like a soldier memorizing a battlefield. She didn't ask for permission to keep it. She simply picked it up and folded it into her jacket. "I'll keep the others out until you're ready." No one asked what ready meant. They all knew it meant deciding who got the last safe sips. Kellen stood back, watching the four adults now gathered around the table, transformed. Not victims, Not protectors. Something quieter, harder. Stewards of a terrible truth. When Percy collapsed just after midnight, convulsing, vomiting, unable to stand, the crowd finally began to splinter. The ones who had cheered his stunt grew quiet, ashamed. The rest backed away from the fence. No more shouting. No more chants. Just the sound of people realizing they had pushed too far, believed too easily. Merritt was the one who made the announcement. He drank runoff. It wasn't filtered. He's poisoned, maybe dying. No one interrupted her. No one doubted. The silence that followed wasn't fear, it was shame, brittle and deep. Inside the Hollis home, the final filters were counted and distributed. Thayer and Ione gave their names last. June held Lark tighter, unsure whether relief or guilt was heavier. Wren remained by the door, watching, listening, memorizing. Kellen stood at the window, note forgotten in his pocket, eyes on the dying man outside. There would be no riot now, no forced entry, just the long, slow realization of limits. The green yard no longer looked like salvation. It looked like what it always was, the lie, and tonight, it had held but only barely. Morning arrived not with hope, but with quiet reckoning. The storm had passed, leaving Vermilion Wells half swallowed by sand, cars buried to their windows, fences flattened, and storefronts erased under fine layers of rust-colored dust. There was no movement at first, no shouting, no panic, just silence, the kind that follows a mistake too big to undo. The hill, once a place of desperate gathering, now bore fewer footprints. The mob had scattered in the night, leaving behind the weight of what they'd almost done. Blaine returned, not in a truck this time, but on foot, shoulders hunched, clothes wrinkled and stained. His bravado had fled, burned off like morning fog. He didn't speak when he reached the gate. He just stood there, eyes glassy, like a man looking at the edge of a grave he dug himself. And behind him, others appeared to not with demands, but with the soft guilt of those who had believed too easily. Teenagers with scratched arms, mothers with dust-wrinkled faces, old men with tools but no fight. No one asked to enter, not now. They waited. And Merritt, now with the voice full of gravel but steady, called them forward not to take, but to build. What followed wasn't a lesson, but something older. Thayer knelt in the yard, dirt beneath his fingernails, and showed the first group how each stone had been placed to pull the nighttime moisture into the roots below. He didn't use long explanations. He just did, and they followed. The dew traps, the condensation tarps stretched low at angles. The airflow corridor carved like a hidden lung through the property. Every piece had been earned, tested, failed, and rebuilt until it worked. No part was magic. That was the lie the town had told itself. Ione, quiet and firm, moved among them like a gardener and a nurse. She showed how to shadow a sprouting seedling with broken glass, how to bury compost where it could feed, not rot. A father named Curtis watched her fingers as if memorizing choreography. A girl named Cora wept as she planted, saying it reminded her of how her grandmother used to tend roses in the highlands before they moved here. Ione didn't comment. She just handed her a new seed. And behind her, Wren mimicked every motion, eyes locked not on the plants, but on Ione's hands, absorbing the rhythm like it was the last language left. By mid-morning, the Hollis yard was no longer a fortress. It was a blueprint. Merritt directed the volunteers without raising her voice. She rotated them, some to the learning circle in the yard, others to clearing sand from the collapsed side of the road. Blaine tried to help, but his hands shook. No one stopped him. Letting him work felt like justice enough. Kellen wrote everything, not in shorthand, not as a reporter looking for a punchline, but in full. His notebook filled with notes on filtration timing, homemade drip systems, soil preservation tactics. He detailed it like scripture, not for publication, but for permanence. At one point, he looked up and saw Wren standing near the hatch, watching the others, her fingers still coated in soil. She didn't speak, but when he met her eyes, she nodded once, solemn and clear. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They were becoming the ones who'd build it. The transformation didn't happen in speeches, but in small acts. June took the cloth off Lark's mouth, and for the first time in days, let him breathe without the barrier. He smiled at her, and she cried again, silently, holding his fingers like she might never let go. Ione handed her a list of edible roots, written in her own slanted script. For the weeks ahead, she said, and June held the paper like it was sacred. Curtis, the father, volunteered to dig on the western slope, asking Thayer if there was a chance to redirect groundwater. Not for now, Thayer said, but maybe someday, and that was enough. Even Blaine, knees in the dirt, finally looked up and muttered, "I didn't know. I thought we had time." No one answered. That was the penalty, perhaps not exile, but understanding. Kellen took the folded map Thayer had once shown Merritt and pinned it to the side of the town hall wall. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. When the town gathered at noon, what was left of it, though still strong enough to work and still soft enough to listen, Kellen stood on the courthouse steps and read aloud. No dramatics, no embellishment, just the truth. The water is real, but not infinite. The green is real, but not a miracle. And the filters, the fragile line between survival and poison, are fewer than anyone wants to admit. He read the list of techniques Thayer and Ione had taught. He read Ione's seed instructions. He named the dates the filters would expire. He read Blaine's name last, as someone who had almost cost them everything, and then stayed to shovel anyway. He didn't accuse. He didn't flatter. He just gave the story back to the people it belonged to. When he was done, no one clapped. But as they turned to look at the Hollis house again, now barely visible behind the busy yard, and new tools, their faces had changed. No longer starved, no longer angry, just tired, awake, human. There was no parade, no breaking news, no miracle rainfall to save Vermilion Wells. The world didn't pivot because of their suffering, and the desert certainly didn't soften. But something else changed, something quieter, more defiant than hope. The people did not wait to be rescued. They adapted. Months passed, and in that span, a slow, deliberate transformation took hold. Rooftops bristled with fog nets made from salvaged screen doors and irrigation mesh. Homes once choked by dust began to breathe, their windows shaded by handmade awnings, their yards ringed with dew-catching stones. In place of desperation, discipline took root. It wasn't perfect. Some efforts failed. Some days still felt like dying. But the town began shaping itself around truth. No longer looking for a miracle, but learning how to live with the weight of the real. And at the top of the hill, where silence once marked a boundary, the Hollis fence stood, repaired not to keep people out, but to remind them what it had cost to let them in. Thayer sat on the porch most afternoons now, a thermos at his side, watching without judgment. He saw hands blister from labor rather than rage. He watched teenagers teach younger kids how to rig tarp condensation systems with pulleys and clothespins. He saw men who once shouted at the gate now show up early to clean filters, shoulders low with humility. The porch had become something like a bench in a small classroom, with people occasionally sitting beside him just to ask how he knew all this. "I lived through something worse once," he would say. Sometimes he said nothing at all, just handed them a book, or pointed to where the wind caught best. Ione no longer cried behind curtains. Her notebook had grown fat with names not of the dying, but of the learning. She logged who built what, who shared which seeds, who returned tools without being asked. The ledger was no longer about rationing, but remembering. It was her way of protecting what they'd all nearly destroyed: trust. Kellen found purpose in a place he never expected to stay. He had stopped trying to leave long ago, not because he gave up, but because he finally saw the worth of staying. He helped erect a shaded shed just beyond the Hollis garden, a space lined with burlap walls, tool racks, water collection diagrams, and homemade charts drawn by children. At the entrance, he pinned Wren's note, the one she had written in a panic, warning that the water could kill if taken the wrong way. He had laminated it with melted candle wax and a sheet of clear plastic. The ink had faded, but the warning still stood, a testament to fear turned into wisdom. Wren came by often, quieter now but not withdrawn. She helped run the shed, taught smaller kids how to tell when a leaf needed more shade, and when to step back and let a plant fail so it could grow stronger the next time. Kellen watched her sometimes and realized he'd never seen anyone her age carry so much knowledge without bragging. She had learned something even grown-ups struggled to grasp. Survival didn't come from hoarding. It came from teaching. Merritt kept her badge, though fewer people called her by her title. She didn't need it to command respect anymore. She worked the yards during the day and rotated shifts in the shed at night, where people came to share ideas, not complaints. She had become something between peacekeeper and gardener, someone who knew when to use a shovel instead of a warning. On one evening, she stood near the yard's shaded edge while Lark ran in circles under the canopy, laughing so hard he dropped to his knees. June watched from the side with both hands over her mouth, trying not to cry in front of the others. Merritt gently touched her shoulder but said nothing, the kind of silence that understood exactly what the moment meant. Lark, once too fragile to breathe without pain, now carried water buckets with his mother to a new plot on the east slope. No one asked if the water was safe anymore. They knew the rules, they understood the limits. And in that understanding, they found strength that didn't require fences or locked doors. Even Blaine returned not as a politician, not with a speech, but with a folder. He handed it to Thayer without ceremony. It was a legal document, plain but potent. The land next to the Hollis plot, the one they'd all fought over, had been transferred into public trust. No strings, no terms. Just a signature and a date, an admission without apology. Blaine didn't stay long. He only nodded once, his face drawn with what might have been remorse, and walked away. Thayer didn't open the folder. He didn't need to. He passed it to Ione, who added it to her notebook like it belonged there all along. That land would become a teaching plot, a communal garden, maybe a seed library if things held together long enough. They weren't waiting for anything anymore, not rain, not permission, not miracles. They were acting together, not as saviors or victims, but as people finally brave enough to build something after almost tearing it apart. And one evening, as the air cooled just enough to walk without wheezing, Thayer rose from his chair and stepped off the porch. He walked to the fence, the same place where Wren had once pressed her ear against the wood, listening for the whisper of water like a ghost story, and placed his palm against the post. Wren, now a little taller, a little steadier, came up beside him and laid her hand over his without a word. There was no speech, no ceremony, just the soft weight of skin on skin, 2 generations folding into each other in an unspoken agreement to remember, to protect, to teach. Behind them, the yard swayed green and quiet, no longer a secret, no longer a prize. It had become what it was always meant to be, a beginning.